The latest talks among the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, the Abu Dhabi Agreement, reshapes the world order. In January 2026, the climate in the GOF region was still pleasant, but in the meeting room of the St. Regis, Habai, the air was as cold as the permafrost of Siberia. Just the day before, EST, RDAY, on January 96, the world witnessed the most powerful and controversial gathering since the outbreak of the most severe local war since World War II in 2022. High H-level delegations from the United States, Russia, and Ukraine finally sat at the same long table. This is not a diplomatic exchange full of ritualistic sense, but an extremely realistic and even cruel business among major powers led by the Trump administration. THIS article does not discuss those vague slogans, we only break down the hardcore logic. TS secret meeting, dubbed the Abu Agreement by the outside world, is redefining our world. In all why, we have reached the final stage of clearly marked prices. By the beginning of 2026, the Russia-Ukraine battlefield will no longer be an inspiring narrative in the headlines, but a colossal meat grinder that mercilessly consumes lives and resources. Years of stalemate have soaked every inch of the front line with blood and depleted Europe. SR's Ina L. But what really forced all parties to sit down was not a change of heart. A sudden change in the tone of Washington. With the second Trump administration coming to power, the White House no longer talked about defending democratic values but began to calculate the return on investment. For this administration of the United States, this war is like a junk project that has been in the red for 4 years and must be liquidated, cut losses, and left in the shortest possible time. Through we witnessed a radical policy of seeking peace through strength. The logic is simple. The United States holds the vital point of Kyiv military aid in its hands and also holds the bait of Moscow lifting sanctions. This kind of coercive mediation has forcibly dragged the conflict from a multilateral war of attrition into the track of transactional negotiations. THIS meeting room in Dhabi is actually a temporary exchange for the New World Order. There is no warmth here, only cold chips. How much security guarantee is this piece of land worth? How many assets could be unfrozen in exchange for that ceasefire? The geopolitical assets of the Kremlin BF or the Dhabi sum Mete officially kicked off. There was actually an extremely crucial prelude, which was the trip to Moscow by Steve Kushner. THIS matter is simply inconceivable in the diplomatic circle. Who are these two people? One is a real estate tycoon in New York, and the other is a former first son-in-law and real estate businessman. They have no restrictions of professional diplomats. Yet, on the evening of January 22nd, they had a 3.5-hour secret talk with Putin at the Kremlin. This is the typical style of true MP-style diplomacy. Get rid of your diplomatic agreements, and let's just talk about business. In this Moscow night talk, geopolitics was simplified into divisible assets. It is said that the conversation not only touched upon the notorious 28-point peace plan, but also delved deeply into the financial aspect. The appearance of Dmitriev, the head of Russia Sovereign Wealth Fund, and Galen Baum, the director of the US Fed-era El Procure MNTHNC, has sent out an extremely clear signal. Americans are attempting to exchange contracts for unfreezing assets, restoring the SWIFT system, and even post-war reconstruction for moderate concessions from Russia on territorial issues. Putin's response was also sophisticated. He claimed the conversation was constructive, firmly defended Donbass in his statement. This is the essence of the Abu Dhabi Agreement. One side wants to cash out quickly through a deal and exit the market, while the other side wants to consolidate the chips it has already seized through negotiations. The three forces at the negotiating table. The simplest way to understand a negotiation is to see who each side sends. The list of the delegation from Abu Dhabi is simply an X-ray of the strategic intentions of a major power. Russia, led by the intelligence chief Moscow, dispatched Adam Ira, L.I. Gore, Kostyukov, the head of the Spies, is an extremely powerful and dangerous signal. Sending G, leader in informal warfare and military intelligence, to talk about peace, indicates that Russia doesn't care about any legal text at all. What they care about is where the specific contact line is, how the buffer zone is drawn, and how to ensure a lasting occupation through military technical means. What Kostyukov held in his hand was not a pen but a ruler. Ukraine, the bottom line E of a wartime cabinet. The expression on the Ukrainian delegation's face was probably the most solemn in the entire venue. The combination of defense is the UMV and chief int ELIGE NC of Isarbad NOV represents the last will of resistance in TIV. Umerov is a symbol of the Crimea issue. He is well aware that any compromise could lead to a political explosion within the country. But NOV, on the other hand, is an expert in shadow warfare. The IR mission is only one: to prevent the country from being quietly sold off by this group of real estate developers at the negotiating table. The UNITED status, UNV and ION, our diplomatic experiments in the UNITED status. The combination of Witkov and the Golo NBA has left many Europe and OIS stunned. THEY represent the Trump administration's distrust of the professional civil service system. Thai's group of people are good at high-pressure business negotiations, identifying the pain points and leverage of the other party. In their view, Ukraine, strategic depth, and Russia's economic sanctions are nothing but price tags on the negotiating table. Thai's kind of thinking is extremely efficient, but also extremely dangerous because it is extremely lacking in all of the historical entanglements of Eurasia. The collision of these three forces in Abu Dhabi is not only a game of interests, but also a conflict of worldviews. Is it the guns and cannons that have the final say, or business? 28 agreement in the corridors of DHABI. What sent chills down the spines of diplomats the most was not the Kremlin's hardline stance, but the draft of the 28-point peace plan that was repeatedly revised in the back of the delegation. When this plan first leaked out, it almost sent KV and the entire Europe into an uproar. Let's set aside those awkward diplomatic expressions and directly look at the most heart-wrenching ones. The established fact of territory. The agreement requires the international community to substantially recognize Crimea, Donetsk, and other places as belonging to Russia. Spies is tantamount to forcing Ukraine to make a painful legal decision to let go. TAT deadly buffer zone. CS is Art ICLE 21, which has most enraged the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. The agreement requires the Ukrainian army to withdraw from the key defense hubs currently under control in Donetsk, such as Kramatorsk, to clear a so-called non-military neutral zone, BSURDLY. This district is classified as Russian territory on the map. This means that Ukraine not only has to lose land, but also has to dismantle the defense line it has painstakingly built for years with its own hands, giving up its strategic depth, put a tight rein on the size of the military. The agreement proposes to limit the Ukrainian military to within 600,000. UNDS quite a lot, but when facing a neighbor with nuclear deterrence and the ability to mobilize 1 million troops at any time, this is tantamount to putting a cotton glove over Ukraine's fist. Political time bomb within 100 days. DEM and ING that a general election be held within 100 days after the agreement is signed. Holding elections in a situation where millions of refugees have been displaced and the war has not yet completely subsided is not so much for democracy as to create chaos for the existing Zelensky government. In the eyes of KV, such a plan is not a blueprint for peace at all, but a surrender instruction manual. So, during the middle of the DHABI summit, The Ukrainian delegation desperately pulled the side to come up with a 19-point amendment in Geneva. The amendment attempts to blur those most extreme provisions, not talking about territorial recognition, but about freezing the front line. Let's not talk about the 100-天 general election. Let's wait until the martial law is lifted. RASE, the numerical restrictions on the size of the military. But this is precisely the cruelest part of negotiations. The Americans want to fast forward to a deal. The Russians want to fast forward to receiving the goods. And the Ukrainians just want to find a stronger rope for themselves before being pushed into the abyss. The Europeans finally saw clearly the Agrem and has chilled Ukraine's heart. Then, for Europe, it is simply a strategic betrayal. For decades, Europe's security logic has been based on the assumption that the united status would take the safety net. Now, the logic of real estate transactions in Washington tells Europe, if the costs are too high, big bro, the R can pull out of the business at any time, leaving a mess behind. Through S, we witnessed the rarest awakening in Europe since World War II到the assembly of voluntary alliances, driven by Paris and London. About 26, Europe and countries began to bypass NATO's bloated decision-making mechanism and attempt to build their own hardcore defense lines. The most substantive move was the rumored European Pacification Force. The logic of this army is extremely sophisticated and helpless. The Y planned to send between 10,000 and 26,000 soldiers into the areas controlled by Ukraine. Listen, they were not going to fight. They were going to be human shields. This is called the tri-Puwai strategy in military terms. I don't have to go to war directly with the Russian army, but I have deployed French soldiers, British soldiers and Polish soldiers behind the Ukrainian army. The Russian army dares to cross the freeze line and continue their offensive. They will run to the soldiers of these major European powers. On CE, there is bloodshed. The entire Europe must step in. This de facto common defense is aimed at filling the security vacuum left by Ukraine's inability to join. But behind this lies a huge crack. The Poles are very proactive, but they prefer to provide air defense and logistics. After all, a powder keg is right at their doorstep. The Germans are still hesitant. On the one hand, they are afraid that the united status will withdraw, and on the other hand, they are afraid that Europe itself will make too much of a fuss and anger Moscow. On the lights of DHBI, the transatlantic alliance is developing. Cracks. The united status is moving towards a unilateral and isolated deal, while Europe is being forced to learn how to pick up that long sword that has rusted for too long in a world without an American umbrella. Some Myung-yi has to foot the bill and someone has to collect the money. Territorial demarcation is the flesh and skin of this negotiation. Then the economic ledger is its skeleton. In the closed-door meetings at the St. Regis Hotel in Abu Dhabi, the most intense discussions are often not about where the tanks should be withdrawn, but rather about how to distribute the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets. This is why there is a role like Josh Glenn Baum, director of the Federal Procurement Bureau in the U.S. delegation. In the logic of the Trump administration, the end of a war must be accompanied by huge business opportunities. IPO on the ruins, the U.S. has a big plan in mind. By using frozen Russian assets or through some kind of complex financial leverage, launch a Ukraine Reconstruction Fund, led by the united status. This not only solves Ukraine's blood transfusion problem, but more importantly, those reconstruction contracts from power grids to railways, from base stations to energy pipelines are likely to fall into the hands of American enterprises. The faucet of sanctions, Dmitriev, the head of sent by Putin, is not here to catch up. Russia's demands are extremely clear. Not only should there be a ceasefire, but also re-access to the system the resumption of energy exports, and the lifting of restrictions on key financial institutions. For Moscow, without the lifting of sanctions, the so-called peace agreement is just a piece of waste paper, as their war machine has already exhausted too much of its economic potential. The legal quagmire in Europe. The most awkward place here is Europe. Most of the frozen Russian assets are located within Europe. Washington unilaterally promises to unfreeze assets in order to reach an agreement. Europe will face huge legal risks and moral pressure. Show Ad 1, follow the United States to share the spoils and seek stability, or adhere to the principles of international law and fight to the end. BRUSSELS has not yet settled this account. To put it bluntly, the negotiations in DHAB are more like a bad debt settlement of geopolitical assets. All parties are striving to prove that they are not compromising but investing in a more cost-effective future. Anno Dr. Ribbon-cutting ceremony of a crisis must admit a cruel reality. The DHAB agreement is not aimed at resolving hatred. It is merely intended to temporarily freeze conflicts. China's strategic silence and delicate position. In this grand drama, Beijing G demonstrated a profound composure. The spokesperson of the meanest right of Volcano AF spoke as usual, but the logic behind it has undergone a qualitative change. For China, if the United States and Russia reach a compromise by acknowledging reality, it will actually set a highly impactful precedent in international practice, that is. The line of actual control takes precedence over the abstract principle of sovereignty. Spies has profound implications for the countries in the global south and even for some potential regional disputes in the future. The crater of Zelensky we cannot ignore. The most is the sentiment within Ukraine. Any agreement with the slightest tint of territorial trade for peace is seen as blatant betrayal by those veterans and nationalists who have shed blood. Zelensky is now like sitting on a volcanic crater. If no agreement is signed, the country might deplete its last drop of blood in a war of attrition. If he signed an agreement like the Ashba Point PLA, he might have to face the third Maidan Revolution in his country. The final deduction. How far are we from peace? Alt Ho, Go, Zhi DHA are still on. The path to true stability remains pitch dark. We can predict three possible outcomes. Armed neutrality, 30%. Fragile balance is achieved where Ukraine is nominally neutral, but is actually fully armed. With European forces entering to maintain the status quo, This is the best outcome. Negotiations broke down 45% because the details such as how to draw the buffer zone fell through. Trump withdrew his stance, forcing Europe to step in alone. The war entered a more bloody and uncontrollable stage. For city surrender, 25%. Ukraine yielded under extreme pressure. This will bring about short-term peace, but in the long run, it will completely destroy the existing international security order and bring the world back to the law of the jungle where the strong reign. The DHAB agreement is essentially a brutal experiment of the international order in the 21st century. I tells us that when major powers start to exchange geopolitical assets like real estate developers, those narratives about justice, sovereignty, and dignity are often pushed to the corner. The Re is no true winner in this game. The Re is only a barely achieved balance between ruins and gold. What you just saw is merely a fragment of the truth. Welcome to the Da Vinci Matrix, the ultimate operating system for the superior in the EVI Dual. We are decoding the world, one algorithm at a time. Click left to rewire your brain. Click right to witness the future. Don't be a spectator. Join the fleet. Subscribe now before the AI takes over.